I'm Patty Williams-Downs, CEO and founder of Breaking Bounds Enterprises. Welcome back for another episode of the Boundary Breakers Podcast, where we share the stories of boundary breakers that are using their unique gifts and talents to transform the world. So please join me in welcoming President and CEO of the Houston Land Bank, community development expert, and boundary breaker, Christa Stoneham.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Yes, me too. This conversation is like long overdue.
Yes.
So I could not be more excited, and I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's just jump in.
Let's do it.
Okay. So tell our listeners who you are and currently what you do.
Absolutely. So I'm Christa Stoneham. I proudly serve as the president and CEO of the Houston Land Bank, which is a community development nonprofit that's both government, so we're able to speak to the policy side, and also really focused on community-based solutions that are led by the community.
Okay. Give us a sample of what that looks like currently what you're doing, because you're everywhere, killing the game on securing so much money and transformation. But give us an example of what that looks like.
Sure. And I think it's best to maybe give a little bit of background on kind of like how I even got here. But my background's in architecture and community development. I'm originally from California. I moved here 20 years ago and really got involved with just understanding this new place that I wanted to call home. And when I started to understand some of the stories and the patterns of the narratives of how these communities were shaped, I knew I wanted to be involved. So fast forward 20 years later, I'm actually able to develop those solutions on how do we create programs, opportunities for people to connect with one another, actual physical, tangible projects such as affordable housing or green space projects. And then, of course, sustaining this work by creating the policies and the rules in order to make sure that regardless of if I'm in this seat or not, this transformational work will continue in historically disinvested communities, which most of them being Black and brown neighborhoods.
Yeah. I've heard you say in previous interviews, we're here for a good time, not a long time, which I know is hearkening back to some other statements, but it's what you're saying around policy is that in order to sustain it, you want it to outlive you.
Yes.
So there are some other stats within your role as president and CEO. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us what is unique about you serving in this role?
So I am also the first African-American person and woman to serve in this role. I'm the youngest CEO and president in the nation for all land banks. There's over 300, and I'm just doing my best every day.
Yes, we see it everywhere. We can't wait for our listeners to hear what that actually looks like. Before we get there, Boundary Breakers are clear on their origin story and where you're from, and you talked a little bit about that, where you were raised and how that shaped you. Mm-hmm. So take us back to California. Take us back to your family. Yeah. What was that like?
Yeah, so I was raised in the Bay Area, so just outside of Oakland, San Francisco. My family was mostly raised in San Francisco, but my grandparents actually come from Texas or Louisiana. Coincidentally, my grandfather was actually born in Third Ward, and I didn't even know that until I actually moved here. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I found that out, and I see the house, and that's a whole nother story. But ultimately, my roots came from the South as a part of the Great Migration when Black Americans were seeking better opportunities for their families. And really, I was raised in the family full of activists. I didn't really think about that till later, but when we're together for family dinner, for Thanksgiving, we're talking about politics, we're talking about what's going on with the mayor, we're talking about just how are we seeking to change, because that stems from my grandparents who wanted a better life for their family and helped educate the family about the importance of assets and getting involved and making a change. So much so, my grandfather actually founded the Juneteenth Festival in San Francisco and brought that from Houston because they had no idea what that meant, and that still continues literally right outside my grandmother's house.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So talk to us a little bit more about some experiences that you had growing up that really said, this is who I am and this is how I show up in the world. It sounds like, politics and advocacy being a commonplace. Are there other things?
Yeah, real estate development. So my grandfather was the first Black dentist in San Francisco and used some of those monies in order to invest into neighborhoods and bought several properties in the Bay Area to turn into affordable housing. And I remember going to his dentist office, and there was kind of like this back hall in the back, and there was these blueprints, and I would go and I would play with them and like unroll them, trying to understand what am I actually looking at, not recognizing that that would actually be a part of my profession later and getting a bachelor's and master's in architecture. But I really remember like the physical blueprints, and they were blue back then, right?
Literally.
They were literally blue.
So what, that's a beautiful story, and how deeply it connects to what's so important to you, nearly 20 years later. What values emerged for you from a child until, you left your home?
Yeah, I think legacy for sure. Just making sure that even, with the economic downturn of California now, my family's able to still sustain there because of the investment that my grandfather made 70 years ago or so. And those properties have appreciated, and family having heir property in order for us to steward moving forward. So having legacy and just understanding the importance of the decisions that we make and the integrity of those decisions, and making sure that you're also giving back while you're coming up as well. Because there was a lot of tenants that weren't necessarily in the best situations, and had to try to work with them, whether it was a single mother or whatever the situation was, of just being in property management, but also understanding that they're people too. It's not just transactions, it's how do you serve, how do you show up, and how do you make sure that as you're representing yourself, you're representing overall your character and the legacy of your family name.
Yeah. So legacy, integrity, and seeing people.
Yeah, empathy.
Empathy. Okay. Legacy, integrity, and empathy. So tell us how you kind of have bottled that and lived that from, California, your transition here. Prior to this, you were in the mayor's office. So sort of walk us through those sets of professional experiences.
Absolutely. It really started, I would say maybe it was around high school. I started to pay a little more attention and think about what I wanted to do with my life. And I knew I didn't want to sit behind a desk. I knew I wanted to do something with creativity. I didn't know it would be community development, though, at the time. But really looking back and understanding just the dynamics of how I even grew up in the suburbs, in the Eastern Bay Area, which is a little more affluent as opposed to West Oakland. But my family also lived there. So when I go and visit my cousins, or my mother, who's also a high school English teacher for Castlemont High School, which is in East Oakland and has a very prominent reputation, I'll say, and just seeing the difference of the education as I'm learning the students. And I knew that I wanted to be around more culture, but I also wanted to better myself. And I was very much invested of going to an HBCU, a historically Black college and university, and chose Prairie View. And just fell in love with living in the country, coming from the big city. But also, once I understood the history of that being a former slave plantation, and also seeing more decisions about who's able to access opportunities and who cannot, even just the politics of Prairie View technically not having its own fund being embedded within Texas A&M, right? Just the dynamics of these decisions that coincidentally are happening for people of color, and me just understanding more that, I really had more opportunities, more than some of my fellow friends that I grew up with. And I wanted to be sure that I was intentional with that time, and especially the investment that my parents made into me being an out-of-state student with over $100,000 in student loans.
Wow.
Now I'll say, praise God, those loans are forgiven now because I've already served my 10 years of service. But it just made me understand the importance of time. How am I showing up? What am I using with that time? And eventually fell in love with architecture and community development. I started working for the city of Prairie View and helping to identify what opportunities could take place for economic growth based off of the dynamics of the HBCU, the school, because it's a college town. That's really when I fell in love and had the pleasure of having an internship back when I was grad school for my master's. my first master's, in architecture.
Okay.
And then fell in love with community development and just been on that path ever since.
Yeah. What, 2 masters is impressive. So shout out to you.
Thank
That's
you.
amazing. The internship and the master's programs, it sounds like you were really steeped in like learning and growing. What were some of the lessons you learned about yourself around that time?
Man, that your voice at the table is important, even though you may not necessarily have the title. So there was specifically an initiative where, like I said, we're creating a strategic plan for the city based on the assets of the university. And I was the intern. I scheduled all the meetings with all the department heads and understood the technologies they were using or the grants they were submitting for. And then we also had an advisory board that was full of bankers and former alumni, city leaders, and I was basically the convener, helped to create the agenda. And even though they were the decision makers, me just being in the room, being able to understand how decisions once again are being made, right? And how they were investing their time on a volunteer basis, and me being the holder of these stories. Like I took the meeting minutes, I ended up creating a 200 and something page strategic plan that culminated the course of maybe a year and a half of meeting with the community, meeting with the school and the city leaders, and just knowing that I was holding an important part of history, of being this, secretary in a sense, but really a historian of just how we're coming together in order to change communities right with the community. And once I understood that I absolutely have a voice at the table, even though I'm not talking that much, I understood that I really needed to sit at more tables. I needed to glean from the leaders and spend more intentional time with them with mentorship, and still have relationships with them today, 20 years later, the different people that were on those boards. So also just the power of relationships and of will, of wanting to. Like, you may not have all the answers, but as long as you're showing up and you have that drive and that ambition and you have that synergy amongst the people that are among you, then you're just inevitable of your success and invincible of what you're seeking to achieve.
Yeah. So what you just said is so powerful, that you were at the table and a secretary, but you were really a historian. And that sort of gave you this insight about your power. You also started to talk a little bit about relationships.
Yeah.
Tell us, what relationships did you build that let you know that that was so important so early on in your professional career?
Yeah. Oh, man. There was, at the time, her name was Jackie Hoyer. She was over the Federal Reserve Bank and the community development division of that department, which is a really big deal, especially as an African-American woman. And I'm seeing all these reflections of me in power positions. So that helped me to understand that also, I could also sit in one of these seats, right? These aren't too much bigger than what your imagination may show. So that was amazing to see. But just, oh man, Courtney Johnson Rose was on that advisory board, who was one of the largest Black-owned developers here in Houston as well. She actually became my professor. She was on my board at the Houston Land Bank. Just being able to still be in that circle. Kevin Riles, who was also my professor, who's a commercial broker, killing the game out here in Houston. And just, I actually jokingly made him the board chair of my directors of life. Just like, if I know that I'm about to do something, I'm like, hey, I'm really thinking about this. I'm gonna call Kevin. And I'm like, I'm gonna submit this and let me know if you're lying.
Talk me off this ledge. I love it. I also like that you kind of voluntold him.
Yes, he accepted it.
Even better. It sounds like you were able to make some really meaningful relationships and people who supported you as a person, but also as a professional, which I think is really important for boundary breakers. To understand is you can do these things as early as your early career and start to develop what is really called your kitchen cabinet. And it sounds like you were able to do that.
Yeah, and especially in community development, it's a team sport. And literally there was representatives of everyone from construction to architecture to banking, the policy leaders, just how decisions are made flows through several people, and being able to see glimpses of their perspectives helped shape what I was interested in, but also gave me enough information to at least be able to speak the language if I'm talking to that particular role.
Yeah.
Because my job is to connect everyone together, right? But if I can't speak engineering versus just, Ms. Johnson who lives down the street, I need to be able to have that vernacular in order to make those connections.
Yeah.
So when I'm designing this strategy of how we're going to impact this together, I'm able to make sure that they see their reflections in what I'm saying as well.
Yeah, that's that integrity and some of your values coming to life. Like you've said together a few times in the last. Yeah, and it sounds like that's really central to not only the role that you play, but how you want to show up in the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just overall, I want to bring the humanity back into real estate. Real estate's very transactional. It's just the traditional approach of just making sure the paper's being pushed through, it's financed, you hand over the keys to someone, and you kind of move forward. Community real estate development is making sure that when you pass those keys on, they're able to sustain it. How can I make sure that they have the economic mobility to earn more money after I give them this affordable house? How can they make sure that they are educated about the importance of a will so they can pass that down to their heirs, right? It's a overall catalytic system of how you're lighting this spark and how you're making sure that they see this fire, that they have the power too. So it's always going to be we for me.
Yeah, it's always we for me. I love that. Tell us how that's showing up in your current work and some of the things that you all are currently focusing on.
Absolutely. And it really, was just so serendipitous of how this all came into fruition. It was around the time I was at the city of Houston. The Houston Land Bank used to be a program that was embedded in the city of Houston.
Okay.
I think it was around maybe 2018 or so when the city decided we should really make this a separate entity, have it really honed in and focused on community development solutions and not just affordable housing and hire staff and expand the mission, et cetera. Around that same time, I was at the city working on an initiative called Complete Communities that was focused on historically disinvested areas. I was focused on Acres Homes, so I led the first Complete Community and helped to identify what the neighborhood wanted to see, what their aspirations were, what were some of the challenges, and I was introduced to the land bank because that's where they owned the most property, was an Acres Home. So I was kind of working alongside with the leadership of just understanding what their mission was, because that was part of my job, of understanding the connections of how we're all moving forward together. I was also appointed as the first ex officio director of the Land Bank Board, so I represented the mayor on that board of directors. Wow. I served in that for maybe about a year and a half, and then when it opened, I applied and went through about a 6 to 9 month interview process.
I thought you were going to say 6 to 9 steps.
Yeah, there was several phases to this, and went through and showed up every time to the best of my ability. But when I was able to be in this seat, and I also explained this in the interview process, is as much as I loved my job at the city of helping the neighborhoods, I was in a facilitator role, right? I had to work with the nonprofits to understand what you needed and help find a funder in order to bridge that gap, which was great. But I wanted to directly impact, because the amount of time sometimes it takes in order to negotiate or to get them to understand what that alignment is, the urgency really expedited the need in me to step into an elevated role that, to be honest, I didn't know if I really even imagined myself in, because I was just so in love with the work. I didn't really care about me being this title or me sitting in this seat, right? But I knew that, especially with COVID, that's, I think, what really accelerated the fire in me, because I'm literally seeing the community members that I work with die. Right, I'm seeing some of my mentors pass away, and I'm like, okay, I'm seeing this turning of events, and I believe that I have the community's trust enough to help speak on their behalf and help activate solutions with the most important asset there is, and the longest one, which is land. So in terms of how we're functioning is we involve the community in every level of the process that we administer, whether it is a community listening session of what to do with this plot of land and working with our architects to literally cut out parking spaces and the unit size. So they're literally seeing this is what we're trying to troubleshoot and figure out for this oddly shaped site. Or it's working with them on a grant application and trying to incorporate what their voices were into the neighborhood plans that I helped to formulate, right? Because there's so many plans here in Houston. With a city with no zoning, we have, we have probably plans about as big as this room, okay? Especially coming from the planning department where I've previously served, and I literally would just go through and just kind of see what was in there. What year was it, right? In the 90s and the 80s, and the stories were still the same.
Yeah.
And I realized that it really takes a developer, a real estate developer, in order to volunteer to be a part of that change. Because it's great to have incentives for them, and not saying that that's not a route, but if this is something that's already a part of their core values of the person and the organization, then that's where really the magic happens.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like there needed to be like a centralized entity, like you're saying, right? To be the go-between or the orchestrator, which is a role that you're familiar playing.
Exactly.
In previous conversations, you have been able to really unearth why the Houston Land Bank is so important, and what you all are doing. And I'd love for you to share that with our listeners. Like, why is your work so important, and why should people care about it?
Absolutely. And I kind of want to say it from two folds, because on one hand, a land bank's job is to activate vacant, abandoned, dilapidated properties. And it's because these properties aren't generating tax dollars. And that's why it's a government nonprofit, because when you activate the land by building a home on it or whatever that solution is, then it appreciates the tax. That percentage goes back to the city and the county and whoever else the taxing entities are. And that is the function of a land bank. But in terms of the Houston Land Bank and how we're incorporating community and us in the vision of how we're moving forward is making sure that the solutions that we're building is also incorporating their neighborhood voices. Because I don't have to really care about if it's affordable housing as long as there's a house on there and you're able to produce this and generate the tax dollars once again. But I want to be sure that we're intentional and helping to rectify some of the injustices that have taken place in the course of America and how it was developed. And specifically, obviously, I'm here in Houston, and there's really a strong need for a focus on the environmental aspect of the contamination that is still here based on how the city was founded.
Give us a little insight. Like we have listeners all across the U.S., so that this is a good point. What is some of the history that really evokes the need for the Houston Land Bank?
Absolutely. It is going back to the access components, right? There's no secret that there were literal laws that said that Black and brown people could not own land. They could not own property. They were property, right? And then as the generations have continued to fight and advocate for basic civil rights. Obviously, the civil rights movement helped open up more doors and provide more opportunities, which helped generate the Great Migration so they could be able to access this, that, and the other. But there still were laws that said that you weren't able to either marry somebody or you weren't able to be employed at this particular place, right? And really, it's not just racism. It's a caste system on how certain people are able to thrive and certain people are not. And that is an intentional design and a decision that a group of people decided to make, right? And I see us as the opposite of being able to also make decisions, but they're able to help heal and rectify these justices for generations to come, because just like they were able to create these restrictions and different components of land to make sure people could not access opportunities, I have that same power to also open doors for others.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the barriers you face in trying to open those doors, because Boundary breakers, we don't shy away from from those barriers. We actually get excited about moving closer to them. So tell us a little bit more in this work. What barriers you face?
Absolutely. Well, definitely, there's some people who just flat out want to be sure that things stay the way that they've been. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And it's not broke for them because they're not on the disadvantaged side. They're still able to build their high rises and, still be able to profit and then move on to the next site because it's very transactional, and just making sure that you're looking at it from how they're able to benefit rather than the surrounding area and how you're incorporating them into the process, because they're the ones that's going to be there for generations, not the developer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what's been challenging along that journey? So there are people's belief systems that you're having to break and have people break up with. What are some other breakings that you are having to deal with?
For sure. I mean, of course, there's funding. The land is so expensive. And because I specifically focus on affordable housing and providing discounts to Black and brown builders, for example, just to build those homes, me being able to purchase additional property is absolutely really challenging because we're already at a deficit, right? If I'm buying land that costs $5 and I'm selling it for 50 cents, where's that additional $4.50 coming from?
Yeah. But give people a sense of what kind of money you are really dealing with and what kind of money you're really in need of.
For sure. Because I really want to hone in and focus on especially the contaminated properties. Now, I do obviously welcome ones that are not, but because I know that is a huge problem here in Houston. Not only do I need the money for the acquisition, I need the money to clean it up, and potentially need the money to provide to our home buyers and or the builders. An example is a site that we own in the near North Side community, which is just outside of downtown. It's the former Yellow Cab headquarters, which, obviously was thriving back in the 90s before Uber and whatnot, and it closed down. And because of all the operations that took place on the site of oil changes and being able to operate heavy machinery for the cars and whatnot, there was several contaminants found in that site. We purchased half of it and went through the cleanup process. It took about 4 years in order to clean that site up, of taking out 20 feet of soil, underground storage tanks, and also installing a vapor barrier to make sure that the contaminated soil won't be able to touch the future development that took place. That obviously took some amount of time, but we weren't able to close on the other half of the site because our funder wasn't able to fulfill. So we actually reached out to the county in order to purchase it, which they did. They purchased it from us. So now we're going to coordinate what that looks like. But in terms of the amount of money, I mean, one, that site appreciated by about $1 million just because it was clean.
Wow. Right.
So that's an economic benefit. But if we didn't have the support that we received from the city of Houston, which they gave us almost about $10 million just to buy the first half of the site.
Yeah.
The second half of the site was about another $5 million. That's $15 million just to have site control.
Yes. Yeah.
That's not even talking about the cleanup. That's not talking about the vertical construction. That's not talking about down payment assistance. So these major deals and transformational change requires a significant investment in order to move forward. And sometimes they may not be shovel ready because of the amount of time, but it absolutely is shovel worthy because just the community is so excited and proud of this asset that was underutilized because of the change of the times.
Yeah.
But now them being able to be a part of the process of seeing what home would look like for them now and us opening the doors to do that with them is really what it's all about.
That's actually a good segue into what I was going to sort of shift to, which is from breaking to bridging and some of the results. So what bridges have you been able to build with the community and how has that been received?
Oh, absolutely. So when I started in this role in 22, we worked together in order to figure out what will this Brownfield program look like, which is basically our environmental program in order to help activate these vacant, contaminated sites. And the Project Yellow Cab was the first one. That's my first Brownfield baby is what I call it.
Brownfield baby.
That was our first Brownfield baby. But from the community excitement, we also realized, and once I really dug deeper into our inventory that we owned,
Yeah.
I realized we owned several brownfields.
The history of land banks in the United States. Land banks have existed in the United States for more than 4 decades, but as recently as 2010, they were a relatively unexplored community development tool. In 2011, Frank Alexander, along with Dan Kildee, published Land Banks and Land Banking. At the time, it was simply a time-saving measure, providing open access to information they were repeatedly sharing on phone calls through their leadership roles in the Center for Community Progress. But this book became so much more. Between the years of 1971 to 2008, only 5 states passed land bank legislation. From 2011 to 2015, 8 states passed land bank legislation, nearly twice the states in less than half the time. Today, Representative Dan Kildee of Michigan is regarded as the father of the modern land bank movement, and Frank Alexander, his architect. And like many leaders in the social sector, the father and architect of land banking hopes to see the day where land banks are not needed to protect our local communities. As they say in the land banks and land banking, our hope is that one day, land banks and land banking in all jurisdictions will be in a position to declare victory and dissolve themselves as independent governmental entities. Until then, boundary breaker Christa Stoneham and the Houston Land Bank, along with more than 300 other land banks and land banking programs in the United States, will continue to transform the housing ecosystem across America by creating more affordable housing and reactivating vacant, abandoned, or damaged properties.
So then we said, well, you know what? We really should have representatives from all the neighborhoods being involved in what we're trying to do with this program that we're formulating in real time. And that was what was birthed of what we call now Juice and Justice, which is our quarterly convening where we welcome different partners or community leaders or people, other practitioners in the environmental space, whether it's air quality or the soil testing or solar, of how they're seeking to show up, to come together, to figure out how can we leverage each other's assets and make sure that our priorities are aligned with one another. So we're building a pipeline of deals and an ecosystem of when it comes to the environmental change that's needed.
Yeah. So you're still building, you're still convening, you're still the historian.
Basically.
You're still creating.
Come on, guys, come to the party.
Everybody come party. Yeah. Come be a part of history. I promise you it's worth it.
For sure.
It sounds like it's been a beautiful process. Tell us, what are, some takeaways, some lessons learned for you personally and you as a leader as you have traversed in this role?
Yeah, and you kind of spoke to it. And one is just staying in love with the process, because sometimes the outcome may not look the way that you think it's going to. And you may be a little discouraged at times because you're like, man, I planned this all perfectly out. And in this perfect scenario, this person came in alignment because they care too. And sometimes that may not be the case. Sometimes they may not be comfortable with doing something that's new. Sometimes they just don't even know the difference, and they may be too prideful to say it. Sometimes your creativity may intimidate some people, being innovative, but still just making sure that you're authentically showing up as yourself and keep showing up, and still like being okay with the piece of who you are and trusting yourself, and just overall how you're continuing to represent your values and the work and the mission, and being honest about where you are and where you struggle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if you closed your eyes and what you were trying to solve, not just with the Houston Land Bank, right? Because it sounds like this is sort of your life's mission in a way.
Oh no, this is for the world.
This is for the world.
Yeah.
So if it were solved, let's just capitulate this into Houston.
Yeah.
If it were solved in Houston, what does Houston look like? What does it sound like?
Man, we have those pieces here, which is why I'm still here, which is why I love it. Like, man, why aren't we moving? Why does no one else care about environmental justice but me? At least that's what it feels like, right? Because you want to see this change, and you're like, man, it feels heavy because you're holding it by yourself, but you're not by yourself. It's a mindset shift, right? But anyways, the pieces of Houston are here. We have the diversity here. We have the people of color, of all types of colors, that are in power and thriving to a certain degree, but there also are some people who don't have access. So to me, it's all of us being on the same accord about what we're seeking to welcome for all Houstonians, and people removing their own personal bias from that to make sure that you are also extending that compassion and that empathy into those solutions as well. And to me, it almost makes me think of the mindset of children, right? Because you start off so bold and just being yourself, of whether you're wearing a tutu, as a little girl, you want to be a ballerina or whatever that is. Like, they're not thinking about all these stigmas and just things that get engraved into you as you have more experiences in life. They're just authentically being themselves and connecting with other people. And there's no maliciousness and intent anywhere in that interaction as well. As we get older, and some things unfortunately are taught to people, and I think it's helping to retrain your mind of some of those things that aren't in alignment with what we need as each other, as people, of connecting on a social, a physical, a mental, and all aspects of who we are as humans.
Yeah.
And then how we show up, of what your gifts are, to connect with each other, to just bring together this beautiful party and artistry of who we are as just people in the core who just have different color skin.
Yeah. Bring together the party.
Yeah.
That's going to be our new conversation. Because you've said that a couple of times. Like, you are the party convener. Yes. So there are lots of boundary breakers and aspiring boundary breakers listening to this. What advice would you give them on their journey?
Man, there's so much I have learned along this way. I think what's coming to me the most is make sure that you are always showing up as your most authentic self. There's people that have told me along this journey that don't get your nails done a certain way, don't wear your hair this way. I obviously have a couple tattoos here and there, right? I like bright colors. I'm a little vibrant, if you can't tell. Right? And people have tried to put me in a box, right? And I don't think it was coming from a malicious place. Now, there were some times that there were some haters in there, right? But I believe that that's the way that they were taught. And especially as a Black and Indigenous woman, and as part of just the culture of making sure your hair is a certain way, right? And as segregation and integration, and there was kind of these underlying truths of what we told ourselves of getting perms and all the different things, right? And I believe now is this reemergence of who we always were and the knowledge of who we always were. So make sure that you're always your most authentic self, and you don't have to speak a certain way or dress a certain way in order for someone to accept you truly, especially if they truly see you and this is who you want to be. Now, there's nothing wrong with growing and strengthening and getting polished, getting coaching, whatever that may be, right? Evolving. But at the end of the day, you know who you are better than anybody else.
Yeah.
And you know the generations that have invested into you, of your why and why you're showing up, and your legacy statement. And once you find that out, don't ever let it go, and be extremely unapologetic about it.
Authenticity and chase down your legacy. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a beautiful answer. Well, thank you, Christa, so much. This conversation is been long overdue and much needed. I cannot wait for our listeners to experience this all across the globe. Absolutely. And join you in it. Before we close out, how should people join you in this movement?
Oh man, there's so many seats at the table, right? Whether you want to come and convene on the environmental justice side and join us at Juice and Justice, that happens once a quarter. Religiously, we make sure that we're bringing the people to the table, and the government regulations as well. Yeah. Of course, we definitely need donations and funding. That is the absolute first need of the organization, us being a land bank.
Yes.
We need some land and we need some money for some land.
We need some bank.
But it's also just the advocacy and the exposure, right? If there's an initiative, a project that we can get involved in, because we're also a professional service provider. We activate properties, right? But we also do the community engagement. We do the architectural plans. We do the environmental work. We do all aspects of the real estate transformation process.
Yep.
And we can do that on the behalf of other entities, right? So whether it's a smaller nonprofit, you need some more capacity, it's a government entity, it potentially could be even a church, right? Because they own land, but they don't necessarily have that expertise of how to activate the land, right? We can potentially align there. So it's the combination of you can come and join us in what we're specifically working on, whether it's a project like Yellow Cab or didn't even touch on the trash incinerator site that we're cleaning up. That's a whole other one, right? So there may be a signature project. It may be just a strategy exchange of how we can partner to strengthen our gifts and alignments, or just join us in making sure that everyone knows that it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah.
And we can come together in order to create a solution if we're all sitting at the same table. So I always welcome more seats at the gathering, at the party.
More seats at the party. More people at the party.
Come on down. It's a good time.
Well, this was such a good time. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate you so much.
Yes. Awesome.
Yes.
And that's another episode of the Boundary Breakers Podcast, where we are amplifying the voices of leaders who are transforming the world through their unique gifts and talents. As you have heard, Boundary Breakers rarely get there alone. If you are a current or aspiring executive seeking to enact meaningful change in your organization and the world, visit our website and learn more about Boundary Breakers strategy consulting and executive coaching services. Or if you believe you fit the profile of a boundary breaker with a message that has the potential to inspire our listeners, share your story with us through the email address in the description. Finally, don't forget to like and subscribe to be the first to know when the new episodes are uploaded. Until then, continue breaking boundaries.